show that never ends. He's so black you could attend. Come inside, come inside. Baby, I'm the best, and the real blade of grass. Careful as you pass, move along, move along. Come inside, the show's about to start. Guaranteed to blow your head apart. Rest assured, you'll get your money's worth. Greatest show in heaven, heaven. You gotta see the show.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer are a band to stand for excess. Everything about that band was overblown from day one. In fact, they were the first supergroup, or a band to be so called.
I played for a group called King Crimson.
I was with the Crazy World of Arthur Brown.
There's a band called The Nice.
Three of them got together, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer were born, and their first album really set the tone. It was very neoclassical, very pretentious, very pompous, very overblown, and quite spectacular.
There were a lot of expectations for what the band were going to do, and when they finally came out with the self-titled album, it was superb.
Any debut album has to be the calling card of a new band. Of course, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were well known in their own right as individuals, but they had to show that what they were going to deliver was more than the sum of the parts, however wonderful the parts were. So it was crucial Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the album that we now know as their first one, hit the ground running, and I think really it has to be said it did.
There's very little doubt that the first album was a great success, and it's no surprise really given the pedigree of the three musicians. There were no weak links in the band. The drumming was excellent, the bass vocals were great, and Keith Emerson of course is a very accomplished and very flamboyant keyboard player.
They basically said from day one, everything louder than everything else, we'll turn it to 11 rather than 10. If somebody's got a double drum kit, we'll have a triple. If somebody's got a 5-tier keyboard, we'll have 2 5-tier keyboards. And if Greg Lake wants a fur rug under his feet, he's got a fur rug under his feet. So the whole thing is in that first album because it is so ridiculous. But it's glorious in its ridiculousness. And it very much is an instrumental album as well. And you can hear the virtuosity of these three from day one.
The Barbarian, which opens the album, sets out the ELP stall right from the start. It's a heavy, instrumental, and vigorous adaptation of a work by the Hungarian 20th century composer Bela Bartok.
Emerson loved his music, but unfortunately Mrs. Bartok, the widow, wasn't all that keen on what they did with it, so there was a little bit of legal toing and froing. I think the credits of the composition were amended, but it was certainly a very stunning opener, and it very often opened their concerts too. It was a real crash bang wallop statement of intent. Emerson, Lake and Palmer going over the top as they very often would in the years to come.
It was taking a little bit of a sacred territory, some of the classical approaches, and rock and rolling it up, which was a little bit dangerous, but they made it work for a rock audience.
It has that Hammond organ sound that's very well constructed in musical terms, and it was a good indicator that the band could rock.
Barbarian was one of my favourites actually. I had it on a tape when I still lived at home, and I just played it to death, and the whole family nearly kicked me out. I just to play it and play it. Just something about the atmosphere of it and the whole feel of it.
Barbarian's not one of my favourite songs off the album, but the debut album years later really consists of, for me, the songs that have a lot of feel, which are things like Take a Pebble, Lucky Man, and more of the acoustic ones.
Take a pebble and cast it to the sea, then watch the rivers that unfold into me.
Take a Pebble was Emerson, Lake and Palmer at their more thoughtful. The Nice, which was the group Keith Emerson had helmed before ELP, had one particular number called Hang On to a Dream, which was written by Tim Hardin. And that was the number where Keith would stop assaulting his organ, so to speak, and go over to the piano. It was a bit of a showcase for what he could do on the piano. And Take a Pebble was more or less the equivalent of that in the ELP repertoire, because it also gave Greg a chance to be a bit soulful and a bit, I don't know, show a bit of his feeling. So it was obviously the calm in between the storms.
The piano sound on the recording has this wonderful kind of almost aquatic sound, like it's underwater, and that's achieved by pressing the keys, holding them down first so they don't make a sound, and whilst you're holding them down, strumming the strings of the piano with a guitar plectrum. So Take a Pebble starts with what you really think is a G flat chord, G flat major 9. But when the bass comes in, it comes a third below what you expect. So it actually comes in on an E flat, and that changes the colour of the chord and makes the chord E flat minor 11, as opposed to and then that moves up a whole tone to F minor 11, which without the bass, when you hear it on its own, you think it's just going to be an A flat major 9, but because the bass is a third down, it changes the colour of the chord again. So the two chords. Very sort of provocative, with these very sort of lush chords. Very simple, just moving backwards and forwards.
Are lying on your grass, wounded words of laughter.
On Take a Pebble, Greg Lake takes the opportunity to broaden both his songwriting and his singing. The result is that his rich tenor voice floats evocatively around Keith Emerson's extended piano improvisation.
Letters of your memories.
Lake's vocals so often are exactly what's needed for the mood, and the mood was slightly laid back, but it's a very good, almost poppy song.
With Take a Pebble, it was the musical ability of all that came together. I don't think there was any one thing that was outstanding. It was just a well-presented song.
Tread the road, cross the abyss, take a look down at the madness.
Knife Edge has a sense of dramatic urgency about it, although the sound separation between the instruments is kept very clear and distinct, which is a tribute to Greg Lake's production of the album. In fact, Greg Lake's vocals on this track are very reminiscent of his days with King Crimson.
You can almost hear Keith Emerson looking at his keyboard, grinning knowingly and saying, there are going to be some knives stuck into you. It's very much a theatrical piece. It's very much on the edge. And because of that, and because it's very neoclassical and really has that thunderous sense of rhythm and occasion, it works beautifully.
Knife Edge is, again, a good example of Emerson, Lake and Palmer when they decide to rock out. They're a very accomplished and very skillful rock band, and it was a good indicator of things that were to come.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer's debut album laid out their manifesto, which was a blend of dynamic, progressive English rock, European classical music and American jazz. Each member of the band expanded on the talents which had brought them into the band in the first place.
I mean, as musicians, the musical ability was almost second to none. As showmen, complete and utter show-offs. It's fantastic.
Music with me is an instinctive thing. I can and have disciplined it. But when you want to put on an emotion such as aggression, and the music is not enough to express it, I let myself loose.
I was once told the story of Keith Emerson actually in a kind of crazed frenzy mid-solo, where he'd gone through as many different keys and done everything on the keyboard that could be done. He'd used dissonance, he'd slid up and down, he'd tried every single setting, and the only thing really left to do was actually to wedge a dagger inside his Hammond, holding down keys, a note cluster, so which would free him up to be able to leave the Hammond and move over to a Moog or another synth and just basically attack that. Obviously I would demonstrate, but I don't happen to have a dagger on me, and this isn't my keyboard.
I remember watching him live, thinking he was one heck of a showman. And that sound that he got was, nobody was getting that kind of a sound then. I guess it was the classical approach with a bit of meat and potatoes behind it.
Keith Emerson was a prodigiously talented keyboard player, and arguably he did for the keyboards what Jimi Hendrix and Pete Townshend did for the guitar. And like Jimi Hendrix and like Pete Townshend, he was also a showman. But the irony was that Keith Emerson's stunts, like playing the keyboards upside down, I remember, or sometimes he would play with his back to the keys. The critics used to mock and revile these stunts, but the critics never seemed to then pick on Hendrix or Townshend when they performed similar stunts, when Hendrix set alight to his guitar or Townshend indulged in a bout of ritual guitar breaking.
Even his critics couldn't doubt that Keith Emerson is one of the most technically gifted keyboard players that rock has ever known. What his critics would say, though, is that sometimes he confuses speed and technique with feeling. Sometimes these guys would play fast and show off their chops, perhaps not always giving it the sort of feeling and passion that you would like to hear.
Keith Emerson's keyboard style is very unique to him, because the fact that there's only really drums and bass with a bit of guitar in Emerson, Lake and Palmer music. He's got a lot of freedom, really, compared to other keyboard players.
I just allow my mind to wander over improvisations at the piano, at the keyboard. I don't know, I have a feeling inside me. It's not a question of visuals or whatever, it's just a feeling inside me, and it's an effect, and I try and live that effect, which I'm after.
Improvisation was the key to so much, because you had three musicians who loved to play around. Keith Emerson was a fantastic keyboard player, and Greg Lake, as a bassist and also a guitarist, could actually play around interpretations, play around basic rhythms and keys, because again he had that talent and ability. And Carl Palmer loved nothing better than letting fly on a kit, almost allowing his hands and his mind to take flight and see if they merged somewhere.
Palmer was a great drummer. he just had his chops down, really. He could sort of solo and keep you interested. So when there was 3 of them playing, it was 3 times as interesting, you know. He had the, I guess, the jazz rock thing really down. With the classical approach as well, it was like the fusion of all of it.
I need to prepare the physical part of my body, like the way my arms move, to improve as a drummer, making sure that my body now is capable of playing all of these things that I've got mentally stored.
Music tutor Gilbert Webster.
Well, I think we should do something now in the repertoire of the classical.
Okay.
Yes, I think William Tell.
Carl Palmer is a fantastic showman. He's a master of his craft, and he brings something to drums which isn't easy to do. It's very hard to find drummers who have a distinctive style, and Palmer is one of those few drummers that you can actually recognise just because of what he plays.
It's always difficult to put Carl Palmer into context because he stands apart from Keith Moon, John Bonham and the like, who were very much rock drummers. Very heavy, very powerful. Carl Palmer belonged to the prog rock era. Now, how Carl Palmer stacks up against the true greats, he's up there with the very best of them. No question at all. If you see Carl Palmer perform live, it's astonishing. His drum solos are among the very few that people can actually watch.
Normally the drum solo is the point where your heart sinks. Even the great John Bonham with Led Zeppelin, I've found that for me in the live arena occasionally his drum solos did drag and it did get dull, but Carl never gets to the point where his drumming drags. His solos are always interesting. They're relatively short, relatively crisp, and they're very well constructed. He thinks about what he's going to do, so in the live arena they bring some real great excitement to the proceedings.
His kit gradually expanded over the life of ELP until it started including an enormous gong. There was a church bell, I remember, and he even used to use a bucket and chain. At one point, his kit weighed over half a ton.
He's a good drummer. He's a more than proficient drummer, and he definitely likes to fiddle, which works well within the context of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But when you compare him to people like Ian Paice out of Deep Purple, Neil Peart out of Rush, and a number of others, to me he doesn't compare.
Very few drummers get their name into a name of a band, so Emerson, Lake and Palmer, by that it's obvious that Emerson and Lake both felt that Carl Palmer was one of the greatest drummers in rock. In fact, Greg Lake had to argue with Carl to get him to give up his gig with the Crazy World of Arthur Brown.
That's what messes you up, is it? Before you were doing something with complicated parallel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I get respect in the band as a bass player, but as a singer, you know, great. Sing the song, man.
You see, like you have to tell me exactly what things you play. You know, like you have to tell me as well, yeah.
Greg Lake consciously developed his acoustic guitar style as a foil to the instrumental bombast from Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer, and indeed to his own bass playing. It's interesting to note that for all Emerson, Lake and Palmer's instrumental bluster, the hits that they had were invariably Greg Lake's acoustic guitar and his voice.
What a lucky man he was.
The guitar has always had a charm for me, an appeal for me, especially the acoustic guitar. And it's just something that I do, you know. I enjoy doing it, I enjoy playing acoustic songs. And I suppose because of that, some of them have been successful.
His contribution was to allow Emerson, Lake and Palmer to do songs with vocals and make them work. When you've got a band who is so good musically and instrumentals actually come to the fore, so often the vocals or the songs with vocals get lost because they sound naff, they don't work, because you lose something.
I think they probably thought they needed songs, which is probably where he came in. I might be wrong, but I think the song thing wasn't quite it for me when I thought of Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
In King Crimson, his first band, Greg Lake obviously had to compete with Robert Fripp, and really that's not possible. So as a guitarist, he was kind of only allowed to come to the fore in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and he does that job very well indeed.
And he wrote most of his songs on guitar, so he was very keen to get the instrument into the mix where he could. Problem being that obviously with Keith Emerson, the virtuoso soloist, I think there were very rarely more than one track on each album where guitar would actually be featured in a solo capacity. When it was, his playing was certainly more than adequate.
After the musical promise of their first album, ELP really delivered on the second, Tarkus. The title track of the album takes up the whole of the first side. It's a dense, intense, rhythmically complex piece that exploits the whole range of Keith Emerson's synthesizers and of Carl Palmer's drum patterns.
Is Tarkus the band's finest album? I'm not sure, but it certainly was a piece that was interesting. It had lots of different colour and textures to it, and by now we were beginning to develop a very unique Emerson, Lake and Palmer sound.
Tarkus is always remembered as a great moment in ELP history, partly because obviously second studio album they had to try and top the first, which had done pretty well by anyone's yardstick. It was a concept album which was all the rage in the 70s, as we well know, and it was something that held together probably better than most concept albums. It had light and shade. The track Battlefield, I'm thinking for instance, that was a Greg Lake showcase, gave a little bit of a rest to the keyboards. But most of it was Keith Emerson really piling on the keyboards, piling on the atmosphere, and going over the top.
Side 2, a lot of decent songs, but not particularly inspiring. Side 1, the title track, 20 minutes plus, which was quite sensational. It was a symphony. It was Emerson, Lake and Palmer going into different parts and different patches and going for different moods and movements. And they actually preempted Yes with Close to the Edge, Genesis with Supper's Ready, all those great prog rock epics. And it still stands up today as a magnificent presentation of what ELP could do.
I think the biggest disappointment with Tarkus was probably the production and the recording. And I don't think that has anything to do with the people concerned. It was more the limitations of the day. It was very much a learning curve, and they were putting a lot of things in there, and many of them worked very, very well. But for me, it's not an album that I would play that much nowadays.
Realize you are. Lead me from tortured dreams, childhood themes of nights alone. Wipe away endless years, childhood tears as dry as stone.
ELP's arrangement of the Russian composer Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition was in their live set from the very beginning and became a live favourite very quickly. In fact, the band always thought that it worked better live than it would in the studio, which was why they decided that they would record it in concert.
How many other bands in the early 70s, when prog rock was at its height, would dare take an entire composition by a classical composer, an entire work if you want, an entire symphony, and interpret it live and put it out? Emerson, Lake and Palmer is probably the answer. I can't think of anybody else who would have attempted it and brought it off so magnificently. Mussorgsky's Pictures as an Exhibition worked beautifully for ELP because it has so many mood changes, but within each mood change there's still an opportunity for pomposity.
It's all a matter of taste, of course, but I certainly prefer Emerson, Lake and Palmer's version to Mussorgsky's pretty sketchy, very dry composition.
It updated, reinterpreted Mussorgsky's performance and presentation. What Mussorgsky would have made of it, who knows?
To do what Emerson did, there'd be many that would say he butchered it, and he probably did, but he butchered it to great effect.
It wasn't particularly faithful to the original, but what Emerson, Lake and Palmer did was play around with it the way they did with so much else, and they had the musicianship to do it and make it work.
I don't remember anybody else doing the sort of epic, over-the-top productions without it being pretentious, but they managed to do it just in an acceptable way, in a way that you went, yes.
Pictures at an Exhibition was classical music played by a rock band. Now, for teenagers like myself, classical music was what your parents listened to. When Emerson, Lake and Palmer got hold of it, it didn't quite sound the same.
I think it's very hard to compare it to the original. The original one was written for strings. It was written, you know, a century or so before. And Mussorgsky certainly didn't have the electronic resources that Keith Emerson had. But yeah, I think they did it very well. I think it was a very brave thing to do. But it wasn't something that was unexpected from Emerson, because if you listen to the pieces he did with the Nice, then there was a vast array of classical arrangements that he had then taken and made his own.
The band take a very structured approach to the original work. They give themselves space for individual solos, or indeed just to rock out as a power trio from time to time. Keith Emerson has a sort of pick and mix approach to his battery of keyboards, while Greg Lake's classical guitar skills work particularly well, and he actually comes up with some very neat lyrics that add sort of poignancy and contrast to the instrumental bluster that's often going on around him.
There's no end to my life, no beginning to my death. Death is
Trilogy was Emerson, Lake and Palmer's fourth album in 18 months, if you can believe it. Admittedly, one was a live album, but in those days, doing an album every 6 months was not an unusual thing. Obviously, if you were touring to promote your albums as well, you had to come up with songs and ideas in the odd rest day that you had. So it's amazing that Trilogy held together as well as it did. It was very much, though, after Tarkus, going back to songs. It wasn't a concept piece as such. Individual songs which had a life of their own, and apart from the Trilogy title track, which was 3 songs in one, so I suppose that was a reversion to type. But Trilogy was much better than perhaps it had a right to be.
In the song Trilogy, he starts off with this wonderful string melody, just on its own. Very sort of haunting, in the key of B major, and then the string note is held on, and the kind of what's sort of a piano ballad type thing comes in, and that begins with B major, an E minor 7. And then we get to this other section where basically the band get a chance to really go off on one, and the time signature moves to 5/4, and we get this chromatic riff. There's just 2 very simple notes between B flat and B, a semitone apart, so you kind of get this. Quite an aggressive, sort of percussive riff in 5/4, and then the 2 more notes are added, an E and an F sharp, so we kind of get, and that changes into, and those become chords. So obviously that's quite a difficult pattern to play, even with 2 hands, but obviously Keith Emerson is doing that with 1 hand, with his left hand, and then he's doing a solo with the right hand on a synth. So it just gives you some kind of insight into the technical sort of requirements to be in ELP.
Trilogy as an album gave ELP an opportunity to develop different themes. It's slightly jazzy in places, slightly ragtime in other places, still got very much the classical theme. They never forgot about explosions, as it were, musical explosions, about going for crescendos, going for climaxes. And it was a good follow-up to Tarkus because it gave the band an opportunity to be more balanced. You don't actually get locked into one track because it's so long and so fascinating. You listen to the whole album. So it was a very, very worthy and worthwhile record.
Although Keith Emerson described Trilogy as just a collection of songs, there's a strongly integrated feel to the album, even though there's no concept there. It's the sound of a band who are feeling supremely confident about really tackling any style that they want to. It's Greg Lake who supplies the hit single from the album with his evocative ballad From the Beginning, which also gives the album an unaccustomed romantic edge.
From the beginning, maybe I might have changed, not been so cool, I've been such a fool. Whatever was done is done.
Yeah, the lyrics and the singing actually did stand out, I think, on Trilogy. I think they had a lot more purpose and meaning than many of the previous Emerson, Lake and Palmer albums and the ones that came later.
You see, it's all clear.
Trilogy Trilogy's a bit of a patchy album. It's definitely a musical curate's egg. It's good in parts, and in other parts it's not so exciting. Overall, though, I like the quality of the playing, and the band is definitely beginning to come on its own, and we're looking forward to the next album, which for me would be the highlight.
Thank you very much.
Trilogy for me, with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I always thought it was the best album they ever did. I think it was a little underrated, or maybe it was just that it was overshadowed by the success of Brain Salad Surgery.
I think Brain Salad Surgery must be the best studio album the band were ever to produce. By now they were completely into their stride, and the quality of the writing on Carnival 9, for example, is really something else.
On the track Carnival 9, we're in the key of A flat major, and we get the kind of the song part of the track, and then as usual the band go off on one, and the song is in A flat, and the kind of the basis for the solo is on an A flat blues riff, so we kind of get this. Which repeats over and over again, and allows Emerson the kind of a platform that he needs to just go off on one, move through different keys, different scales, and just basically express himself on the keyboard. Carnival 9 is based upon sonata form, which is a three-section sort of symphonic form, exposition, development and recapitulation. In this song, the exposition section is basically the first part of the song, where all the ideas are put forward. The second section, the development section, is the solo part where Emerson just goes off on one and really develops all the ideas that they've used in the first section. And then the third and final section is the recapitulation, where they basically come back and recap on their ideas that they used in the first section. And in this case, obviously, the song comes back after the solo. And then to end it all, we have a kind of a coda or an outro section to finish the song off.
Welcome Back My Friends is one of the great live albums from the 70s, from a band who were at their peak. It has the same luxurious sound that the band were devoting to their stage sound at that time. From the opening siren that heralds a breakneck version of Hoedown, the band take every opportunity to embellish their previous studio efforts.
Frequently when lists are compiled that Welcome Back My Friends doesn't make it, but for me it's one of the great live albums, and in this case a triple live album.
Deep Purple were happy with a double. Thin Lizzy were happy with a double. UFO were going to be happy with a double. Everyone was single, double. Oh no, not Emerson, Lake and Palmer. We're going to have a triple live album.
I mean, whether you liked Emerson, Lake and Palmer or you hated them, no one can take away the fact that it was a highly innovative thing to bring out 3 long-playing records in one one pack. And I think, if I remember, it was the price of 2 albums when they brought it out. It was action-packed.
Captures what Emerson, Lake and Palmer were about, and they were a hell of a good live band as well. Let's not forget that. People always think about Emerson, Lake and Palmer in terms of musical excess, but Keith Emerson in particular was a great live performer, and Carl Palmer wasn't far behind him.
It's a shame that perhaps DVDs and videos weren't released with albums at the same time, because that would have given the other dimension that you missed. Certainly the showmanship of Keith Emerson, the Persian carpets on the stage, all the rest of the flim-flam that ELP took around with them. So if you actually went to the gigs, I think you did get a dimension that the record didn't have.
Works Volume 1 was a double album where each member of the group had one side to themselves and the fourth side was devoted to the group.
Keith Emerson does a piano concerto, which is excellent, but also, it has to be said, very self-indulgent. Greg Lake comes up with a side of songs, some of which, like C'est la vie, work beautifully, others of which are a little bit throwaway. Carl Palmer, who probably has the most successful of the individual sides, just comes up with a whole flurry of different instrumental tour de forces, including Tank, and brings in people like Joe Walsh. It is quite fabulous.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer quite enjoyed, I think, taking risks musically, doing something that maybe everybody wasn't doing, being a little bit avant-garde and not really caring what people thought. Not frightened to use dissonance. By that I mean the kind of the clashing of notes, what most people would consider to be a nasty sound. They quite enjoyed the fact that it was nasty and that it got a certain effect. So when you're trying to create moods, obviously, you know, there are darker moods that need to be kind of portrayed through dissonance.
Works 1 was completely pretentious and completely overblown, but then that's exactly what Emerson, Lake and Palmer were always about. So really there's nothing wrong with that. They had the money and the ability to indulge themselves, and they certainly didn't do that by halves.
It's typical ELP. The great excess becomes their strength and their biggest weakness. What can one say?
We'd like to feature Greg Lake now on our number off of our album Works Volume 1. This is Greg Lake's song called C'est la vie.
C'est la vie. Have your leaves all turned to brown? Will you scatter them around you? C'est la vie. Do you love?
The C'est la vie starts off in D minor in 4/4, and then after we kind of get the sort of main chunk of the song, it moves into 3/4 in waltz time for the accordion solo, which sounds very, very French. The accordion sounds very French in itself, just playing on its own, but you know, added to the fact that it's in a minor key, it's in waltz time, and you've got this very kind of French chromatic descending line through the D minor chord, reminiscent of Michelle by the Beatles. So the 12-string guitar takes care of the rhythmic angle of the song really throughout. There's hardly any percussion in it, and there's no really beat to kind of lock into. So the 12-string arpeggio, this broken chord that goes up and down, that really runs through the song and kind of knits it together. Then around that we've got this orchestration that fits sort of perfectly. And then a very reverbed vocal from Greg Lake, but what an amazing voice.
I think fans felt in a strange sort of way that the fact they had to do things on their own, well, not technically on their own, but things where the other guys were sidemen, almost said, well, we're not really sure what we've come up with as a trio cuts the mustard. It was almost, well, this is serious music, what we've done up till now may not quite be serious. And I think that was the problem a lot of fans had with it.
ELP's reworking of Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man was the highlight of the fourth side of the album, Works 1, which was in fact the only side to feature the group. It captured the group in full flight, although it has to be said some people were beginning to mutter by now that this style was becoming a little bit hackneyed.
They did have to run Fanfare by the composer for his permission. When they did that, Keith Emerson decided he would cut out a bit of the improvisation he does on the track and just send the basic track to him. And Copland came back saying, well, what have you done with it that I haven't done? So Emerson then came back and said, well, actually, I cut out a bit that I thought might offend you. Copland liked the improvised version, gave it his thumbs up, and so off we went with Fanfare for the Common Man.
When I first heard that, I was just like, what is that? Just epic, a real masterpiece.
Well, Copland's music in itself was quite overblown and pompous in the first place. So for a band like Emerson, Lake and Palmer to grab an item like that and do their thing to it, I think it was going to work right from the beginning. And it became a signature piece for the band later on.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer took it and made it their own. In fact, you can't really hear it anymore without hearing ELP. From the open silence and the portentous drum sound that slowly leads in to the brass sound, the trumpets hailing the fanfare for the common man, it works brilliantly, and then they soar into it.
The introduction in the Emerson, Lake and Palmer is more exciting than Copland's version, but both fall away. You know, there's very little there to sustain the piece after the initial introduction. So ELP's meanders off, but then so does Copland's. Neither of them are particularly great.
Pirates was a musical interpretation, a composition originally put forward for a film soundtrack. Now, I think it was originally put forward for a film called Dogs of War, but rejected. So they turned it into Pirates, which is about pirates of the Caribbean, sailing the seven seas, raiding ships, stealing gold, going into shore, getting very drunk and doing what you do when you get very drunk.
Take
Pirates was a soundtrack-styled piece that frankly lacked the impetus or the intensity of some of the earlier classics like Tarkus or Carnival 9. It was perhaps the first indication that ELP were beginning to run out of steam. The 2.5-year break that they'd just taken had meant to be to recharge their batteries, but in fact it only seemed to have driven them further apart.
I only started working with Emerson, Lake and Palmer in the early 90s on the comeback tours, but what impressed me was the way they'd taken pieces like Pirates and they were able to deliver them live on stage probably better than they had done first time round, because they were much more muscular, they were in a way kind of stripped down, they were performed without any meandering solos or moving off too much, and they came across fantastically well.
It was something that ELP, I think, possibly didn't better, certainly in the rest of their career together, but it was a great way to end works, and if you did play the whole thing through all 4 sides, which you'd have to be a really big fan to do in one sitting, Pirates was a great way to end.
Well, Works is a funny album to listen to nowadays. It's not one that I'd pull out willingly and listen to, but when you do listen to it, you know, the playing from all 3 members is superb. The choice of songs from some of them is a little diabolical, and it certainly doesn't hold together as an album, for instance, like Brain Salad Surgery or Trilogy did, but it's interesting.
But you have to remember at that time the market was immense. The whole world were interested and were waiting to hear this great album, and ultimately it was a great disappointment.
Works Volume 2 was a collection of singles and leftovers from the earlier Works album. It was actually more concise and less weighty.
Man living in a can, skipping a suitcase. Grail living in a gale, slipping on blue face.
Works Volume 2 went into the band. It was very much about the band, and each song had all the band on. Don't think it works quite as well because it's much more self-contained and disciplined, but it's got some great moments, and it has some songs that really stand up very, very well even to this day.
But in the end, it was dragged down by the weight of its predecessor, Works 1, and should probably have been called something different.
Works 2, I think, was really just a collection of material they had left over, which I think really filled contractual obligations more than anything else. That's certainly what it appeared to be.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer made the biggest mistake of their career when they decided, we're going to tour in America with a symphony orchestra. We're taking a symphony orchestra with us so we can actually give these musical pieces the sort of interpretation they deserve. They need a 70-piece orchestra, we're bringing one with us. Financially, it crippled them, an absolute disaster. And why on earth anybody ever thought that taking a full-blown orchestra on the road for a whole tour was going to work, I do not know.
Technically, they were able to make it work by miking up every single member of the orchestra and pumping them through a 77,000-watt sound system. And musically, both ELP and the orchestra seemed to enjoy the experience. But economically, it was always going to be fragile.
One of the problems that they had was that there were musicians' union rules where you could only take your orchestra up to 100 miles from the last gig. Obviously, that meant that the houses were perhaps not as full as they should have been because people who lived halfway would already have gone to see the show.
This was 1977, and the smell of punk was strong in the air. And ELP needed to sell out the complete tour in order to make it work. After 3 weeks, they were on course to lose £2 million, and they had to take the decision to abandon it.
By the time Emerson, Lake and Palmer came to work with the orchestra, there was nothing new about it. John Lord had done it in 1969 with decidedly mixed results, so it wasn't as if this was something that none of us had heard before. And I don't think the orchestra really brings much to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and it certainly doesn't translate much the other way. So really the whole thing was a bit disappointing.
I think by the time Works Live came out, ELP was well on the wane. You know, punk had hit the scenes both in the UK and in America, and they were kind of on a losing wicket in that respect. Really, most of the pieces that became commonly associated with them, with the exception of Fanfare for the Common Man, had already been and gone.
Love Beach was recorded in Nassau in 1978, after their record company reminded them that they still owed them one more album. The band were actually exhausted from constant touring, which they'd had to undergo in order to pay off the debts of the ill-fated Orchestral tour. So they didn't really have any ideas when they got there.
Love Beach was a disaster. Again, the word has to be used. From the cover to the songs, it's awful.
I'm not even sure if you can buy it on CD these days. I think the less said the better, really. They'd lost their compositional edge and it felt like a very lacklustre album indeed.
The result was a series of disjointed pieces and one rather meandering conceptual piece, which didn't really do them justice. By now they were frankly floundering.
Love Beach was a weaker album than any album they'd ever done, with the exception possibly of Works 2. But there were a few good things on it. But I think more it was a victim of circumstance and a victim of the time.
Punk was starting to really knock at the prog rock giants, the dinosaurs if you will. A lot of the prog rock bands adapted, or alternatively kept going as they were, believing their audience would stick to them. Those that adapted, for instance Genesis did it very well, and did it but through an understanding of what it would take to succeed in a new era and a new environment. Emerson, Lake and Palmer didn't have a clue. They went up to Compass Point in Nassau, recorded an album full of terrible songs that really didn't fit what they were, and tried to sell it to an audience who didn't want it, on the back also of a younger audience saying that that sort of band is dinosaur and hopeless. They played right into the hands of the critics who said that day has gone, these bands should give up and retire. And you know what? After Love Beach, they did.
After 14 years of solo careers and various reunions, which didn't actually always involve all three original members, ELP were cajoled back into the studio for one more album by a friend of theirs who'd been in Atlantic Records called Phil Carson.
1992, different time, different era, different place, different way of working. And there was a lot of excitement about Black Moon, but as an album it's not particularly good, because I think ELP tried to fall between too many stools. They tried to be who they were whilst acknowledging what was going on musically at the time.
There'd been a reasonable length of time elapsed, so people were prepared to accept it on its own merits, unlike Love Beach, which was a bit of a postscript to the original tale that people found disappointing. So actually Black Moon was a pretty good album, all things considered, and certainly if people were willing to take it almost as the first album of the Second Coming, they were pretty impressed with what they heard.
When I first bought Black Moon, I put it on and thought, you know, is this going to be a good one or not? And I think I was quite pleasantly surprised with it. It was not a bad album.
I started working with a band at the same time as they just released Black Moon, and I was completely blown away by it. It's an album that's definitely worth getting a hold of. It's got the essence of ELP. There's a wonderful interpretation of Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet theme, and the songs are superb, the production's superb.
Black Moon had some surprisingly heavy pieces in it, and if anything, I think it was almost harking back to the days of one or two songs off their debut album, certainly one or two that were off Trilogy.
The most important thing it did is give them a springboard to go back on the road, because that's what people wanted to see them. People wanted to be out there hearing the great numbers that they did and seeing them perform live.
There were some great shows. I remember filming ELP at the Albert Hall and also Birmingham Symphony Hall, and seeing some of the best rock concerts I think I've ever seen in my entire life. It really should have heralded a return for the band, but because the group had never been fantastic composers, I suppose, they lost their audience in the 70s. And they hadn't sustained their crowd in the same way that Genesis or Yes did. So by the time the comeback was made, although the product was excellent, Black Moon is a great album, the audience really wasn't there to sustain the band.
I think it would be nice for the band to try and get together and record something again, but not just any old thing as they've appeared to do in the last 10 years, on and off. They really need to sit down and compose some very, very clever pieces, possibly a double album's worth. Works 3 maybe.